Bonjour, bonjour, bonjour. Hello, everyone. It is delightful to be here with you this evening. In particular, it is delightful to be here with you, Dr. Varden, diving into all things that are poopy and gut related. Let's call it for what it is. It is a webinar on poop. So I know I'm excited to get into what we're exploring this evening in particular, because I think I would imagine you're in the same boat, but I get a lot of questions from people of chicken or egg. Do my genes influence my biome, or does my biome influence my genes? And we get to give them the answer of yes. But at least tonight we get to explore what yes means, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it is so amazing, the capacity of our genes and how it influences and presents in our bodies of what we call our phenotype, and then turning around and the things that we are exposed to, the what's at the end of our forks, what we put on in our mouths, directly affecting those genes. And that's what I want to kind of bring up about setting that stage about the chicken and the egg. And the chicken and the egg, in the terms that we're talking about, is nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. And these are two very closely related but distinct fields of study of nutrition and genetics. So nutrigenetics, this looks at how inherited genetic differences influence nutrient metabolism, absorption, and utilization. For example, like variations in the MTHFR gene or SHMT1 genes. Now, both of these are in the methylation pathway. These genes can affect folate metabolism, potentially requiring different dietary recommendations for those individuals with certain genotypes. Okay. So on the flip side, nutrigenomics looks at how nutrients come back and influence gene expression. It really explores how food components turn on and off certain genes, potentially affecting health outcomes. Now, this field really examines that interaction between the nutrients and our genome at that molecular level. And that includes how diet influences metabolic pathways, these homeostatic controls, the way that our bodies help to balance each other. So really, in essence, bottom line, nutrigenetics looks at how our genes affect our response to diet, where nutrigenomics examines how our diet affects our genes.
And I think let's again take it even another step back, I think, before we get into the field of study. And I think one of the more, because I think you're highlighting that it's really important that our genes are not fatalistic, that what we choose to do influences how things are going to be set up. And I think science is by and large echoing this, right? So to kind of delineate those two spaces, right? Scientists have asked the question of, do your genes dictate what your biome is going to be? Or is it that what you do influences? And there's kind of a little bit of a separation. And the answer that they found was both. Okay, so this stems from a study. It was quite a foundational study published in Nature Genetic in about 2016. Okay. And what they looked at, I believe it was a Finnish population. It was a Northern European population. I think it was Finnish. And what they looked at was they looked at people's poop, they looked at people's diet, and they normalized for things. So for example, they took all females in the same category, all males in the same category. They then subdivided approximately by BMI. So BMI is a rough estimate of height and weight. Okay, so these people were normalized against certain things. And they said, based on the bacteria within the poop, right? Can we kind of correlate that to people's genes? Do people's genes influence what is going to be bacterially showing up? And the paper said a few different things. I think the first thing, and this is really important for everyone to hear tonight, because this gets into what Dr. Varden is saying, right? First and foremost comes diet. You could have the best genes in the world, But if you are not properly feeding yourself, namely giving those genes the nutritions to express properly, it's all for none. So first and foremost, diet. The study acknowledged that right off the bat. That said, it was able to really correlate both metabolics meaning how do you process your food? If I put carbs into you, how does your body receive that compared to how do you receive fats? So the metabolics of it, how does your body receive? They saw strong correlations. So they were able to say people with this type of bacteria tend to also actually have these sorts of genes, right? And they were also able to see that within the immune system, right? Anyone's that listened to some of our webinars, right? We know that we talk often about how the bacteria, the little buggies in our body, dictate how our immune system engages with the world. So the study really clearly said that there was a strong correlation between the two, but it was to an extent all for none if you're not eating properly. And to Dr. Varden's point around nutrigenetics versus nutrigenomics, it's that idea if you're not properly feeding your body, right? If you're not properly feeding it, you're not going to be able to set up either the biome or that good expression of genes. So to me, this was a really interesting study because it said almost, well, your genes are important. It's not really a gene that says, here, set up a good biome environment. Instead, it's more talking to the genes of how do you process food? How do you process your immune system? Which to me is interesting because then it really, again, speaks to that power of the fork. And a step beyond that, do you know what your genes say about what should be on your fork? Because not all forks are created equal.
That is true. And I
Yeah.
mean, you consider that our gut microbiome is comprised of around 100 trillion microorganisms. I
That
mean,
like
that is like, holy moly. I mean, it's that's also one of the reasons why, when you consider that the emerging evidence has shown that the gut biome is a critical component of overall health, like you were saying, with the immune system, with the way the functionality and the basic metabolism, but it gaining that recognition as a vital organ due to this, very multi-directional communication with other body systems,
yeah.
neural, endocrine, humoral, immunological, that
Yeah.
metabolic pathways. I mean, it is amazing, the realization in science when, it was first proposed, the gut-brain
Yeah.
axis,
Yeah.
which was absolutely laughed at initially, but the amount of research, even in the last 10 years, when I was at the university, I mean, there were over like 20,000. And now, I mean, it is just blowing up, in the hundreds of thousands of research that has come out with it. And the information that we are gaining from the testing, to be able to see what that population is, to see, what all these little buggies, which ones they are. And we haven't even been able
Yeah.
to identify them all, you know.
The the computer scientist in me is just, I'm having a field day. So I started my computer science studies maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Someone have to, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago is when I started into computer science. And I remember at the time, especially when we were talking about large data and AI, it was something I sincerely thought I would see at the end of my life. FYI, I'm not close to the end of my life. I hope not, unless a bus comes, it could happen, but nowhere near that. But we're already starting to see that computer power. And to Dr. Varden's point, and this is so, so cool. So for the nerds out there, get really excited about this. We can take a poop sample, we can toss it through a computer, and that computer, based on all this research that we now have, can say, based on your biome, we would expect you to have anxiety, IBS, cardiovascular issues. It can actually list out, that's how intricately, like Dr. Varden's, how many gajillion trillion little buggies that you have, whatever that number is,
Well,
right?
there are over like 1,000 species, and they carry about 150 times more genes than our entire human genome.
So we are more bug then we are human, which is thanks. I appreciate you. And my nightmares
Well, you
appreciate
consider
you.
our mitochondria as well. I mean, come on.
Girl,
We are part of our environment. That is how connected we are.
but I said it right. Yeah. So I think all this to say though, I think to me, what's very powerful and what's very interesting is that how you feed yourself and how your genes influence how you feed yourself. I'm talking both metabolic and the appetite genes. Those ones are really important to me when we have these sorts of conversations, right? That influences the makeup of your biome, which then influences what disease, what things you are at risk for. And I think just like there's no clear definition between human and bug in the sense of if we're more bug than human, right? There's really no clear definition between the influence of the two, which to me is so cool because then now it says we can't control our genes. There's a genetic lottery. You were born with a bunch. You don't really get to change them. But what you can control is how do you understand your genes? And then how does that translate to what's on your fork? Right. So I wonder, Dr. Varden, if we can spend time focusing on that tonight, because if that's truly what we have most control over, right? What goes on our fork, and then how do we feel about that from an appetite and mental health perspective, right? That's what's going to influence the poop, which then in turn influences risk for IBD and cardiovascular and anxiety and all of the things that we know it influences. So I wonder if we start talking a little bit about genes that influence how you metabolize, and then separately, how do you feel about what you're metabolizing? Where do you want to start? Do you have a preference?
Yes, let's
Ah,
see
yes.
what our poll answers are.
Oh, look at you keeping me on track. Just, yeah, merci, Medell. Can the powers that be toss them up? I love it. It's funny. When I asked that question, I was like, we should also check the poll, but I just asked her the question. So I'm glad that we have bugs that are brain vibing together. Cool. Okay, so we asked first our audience, what are the age groups? Interestingly, we have much more of a diversity in our age groups this evening. So typically we tend, and they're such a favorite group of mine, we tend to see people 60 and over. And while that still makes up a majority of our audience, about 40% of us this evening are sitting at 60 or over, we still have strong showings in younger demographics. So we have about 30% of our audience here who's in their 50s. Hello. And then about 20% that is sitting just below that. So those under 49. So as well to the youngins, welcome. We're grateful. We're actually very grateful to have this spread in age. I think it's such a powerful thing when different generations get together to share and learn together. The next question we asked is, have you experienced any of the following symptoms? So these are some of them are, I think people would expect to be typical, right? With GI and with bugs, right? We talk about gas and bloating and constipation, diarrhea, the very obvious, but we also tossed in there, and I'm glad our audience is able to associate this. We also tossed in some other things that aren't always intuitively connected. So we talked about brain fog, and unfortunately, 70% of our audience is experiencing that. Let's talk about that and how the gut can influence that. Talking about almost 70% again of our audience is experiencing fatigue or low energy. The shocking thing here is most of the symptoms we saw, about 65 to 70% of our audience is experiencing each one. Only 5% are saying they don't experience anything, which to me is, I'm glad our audience is here and hopefully we can offer some support as we navigate this. There's about 1% that said other. Please do toss that in the chat because we want to be here to serve you tonight. So if there's something else you're struggling with, toss it into the chat. We then asked, how would you rate your current gut health? And approximately 50% of our audience is saying okay to not so great. So we have 50%, I like this, that's saying pretty good, occasional, but pretty good, but another 50% that's saying it's problematic, right? The last question we asked is, have you done any of our testing? And about 70% of our audience has done their DNA 360. So that 70%, I'd really encourage you to find your test, grab it, so that as Dr. Varden's exploring some of these genes, you're able to look at the test and say, oh, that's my FUT2, or ooh, that's my FTO, whatever the gene might be. Make sure you have your test handy this evening. And if you don't, just write down the gene and you can look it up later. Okay. I believe that is all. I do see in the chat that some people are talking about skin health and eczema as kind of an other thing. I love that you brought up skin. I know that my gut and my skin are pretty much one in one, and I don't feel it in my gut, but I see it in my skin. So I'm glad that we'll get to explore that a little bit, because I think gut health is your skin's almost a mirror for what's going on in your gut. Okay, Dr. Varden, misorganized, and I'm so grateful for this. Do we have any other homework before we get to jump into either metabolics or appetite?
Well, I wanted to say that, our last question, like how many people have gotten their DNA 360 done? And a large percentage of you have. And that looks at the nutrigenetics aspect.
Mm,
If you want to look at the nutrigenomics aspect, that would be our Gut 360 test,
yeah,
because that's really looking at what your current population
yeah,
is. Like you were saying at the top of this webinar about the Finnish study, where food makes a big difference. I mean, regardless, and I say that lightly, of what your genes are, that it really is the food, what you are taking in,
yeah,
also the toxins um, that can affect how your genes are being expressed
yeah,
or not expressed, as the case may be. So, working on that, each side of that coin, you have the foundation of the DNA 360.
yeah.
Then you need to track it and
Or
say, what do we currently have? And,
yeah,
changes that you are making, you want to be able to test, not guess, and track the changes over
yeah,
time for the hard work that you are putting in, the diligence
yeah,
that you're putting in.
yeah. I always find it, like, to your point, impacting your genetic expression, but also separate to that, just even impacting how your body is metabolizing the food, right? Because we talk a lot about one of the benefits of our biome. It's a reciprocal relationship, right? We feed it and then it feeds us. So, for example, if you give it fiber, it's going to shoot out a bunch of short chain fatty acids, right? And then that helps with digestion, it helps with all these other things. But to me, it's interesting. So, we know that our biome feeds us, and this can be in good and bad ways. So, for example, if you do your gut 360, it talks a lot about different families. One of the families, and hopefully I'm saying this correctly, is called Firmicutes, or something very close to that.
Firmicutes. Yes.
There we go. So
There you
close.
go.
Close enough, close enough.
Yes.
And this family is a family that loves fat, right? You give it a dollop of duck fat, you give it some avocado, you give it coconut milk, whatever it is, right? It goes munch, 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 munch. And there's kind of like this happy little sweet spot. You want enough to support that really good metabolism of fat, but the moment you overdo it, i.e., the moment you're consuming more fat than is adequate for your genes and your body and your diet, this family kind of explodes in the sense that it starts to take up more real estate in the gut, and it influences how much energy you're deriving from food. Meaning, the bigger this family is, the more energy you're deriving from your food, the more calories you're taking in. So, this is, again, it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but this population in larger amounts, in kind of out of balance, disproportionate amounts, is seen in people with weight issues, and seen in people with obesity. And again, chicken and egg, is that because they're consuming foods that encourage this family, or is that because this family is encouraging extra calorie extraction from the food? Right. So knowing what's going on in the little buggies in your gut can really help, I think, especially from my perspective, based on what the goal is of either weight loss or weight gain. There's people that want both, right? Knowing those populations can really shift kind of where you're putting your macro, your food energy towards. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. I love that. I love your mantra of test, don't guess.
And I'll tell you, for those, because I saw in the chat, for those people who have your DNA 360 in front of you, a lot of the genes we will be referring to tonight can be found in your diet nutrition report, as well as the anti-inflammation. As Dr. Kosterman just said, about the inflammation and the gut because of the short chain fatty acids that are produced by these beneficial gut bacteria, like the Firmicutes phylum. It actually helps with inflammation control. And, because short chain fatty acids and butyrate being one in particular, they have significant anti-inflammatory properties. They help maintain that gut barrier integrity. And there's been studies that have shown that they consistently are associated with lower risk of inflammatory autoimmune and cardiometabolic diseases, that lowers. But there's always that fine line, like that bell curve, like you were saying, it's like really good, but too much of a good thing, not so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is in the balance. And this is where, having the tests like our Gut 360, we can actually see where your percentages lie, along with Bacteroidetes, which also produce butyrate and other short chain fatty acids. They're more of that carbohydrate loving and munching bacterium. But it's everything in proportion.
Yeah.
And so getting to these metabolites, these beneficial anti-inflammatory metabolites, let's consider and talk about that gut-brain axis, okay, and how the fact that genetic factors significantly influence how that gut-brain immune axis functions. So now, granted, direct evidence linking specific genes to neurotransmitter production through gut microbiota, that's still emerging. I mean, the science is constantly, producing, and we are finding more and more. But research does establish that genetic variations affect the composition of gut bacteria that produce these neurotransmitter precursors and that help to regulate neurotransmitters. And I mean, we're talking about numerous neuroactive compounds like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA. All of these things influence brain function, influence mood regulation. So, it's very important that we are feeding the good guys to help produce these metabolites to then go down that dominoes, that pathway to make sure that we are producing the good neurotransmitters. So we have those good feelings, so we can have regulated mood.
I think one of my so as a naturopath, I have the privilege of part of my coursework, part of my study was studying plants and becoming really good friends with plants, in particular medicinal plants. And I think one of my favorite things through that study was learning that many of the plants that support gut, so if someone comes to you and says, hey, my gut's upset, many of the plants that you would prescribe for that are also very similar and a huge overlap with many of the plants that if someone came to you and said, I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling anxious, there is an incredible overlap. And to me, what that says is that it's been known, and the body already knows, that in order to have good mind, you also have to have good gut, right? That if you're able to influence gut, you also influence mind, and vice versa. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there, Dr. Varden, with that beautiful access, right? We have a product called Deep Calm. And it's a really beautiful blend of herbs and a few other things that are calming. And sometimes I actually prescribe it for people with gut issues. And they're like, why? That doesn't make sense. And then I explain the overlap and they're like, oh, that makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
Now it makes sense. Yeah.
And I mean, the interesting thing is that there's a very striking study that found several species of gut bacteria consistently missing in people with depression. And following that discovery, there have been interventions based on gut biome and, for mental health treatment, including clinical trials in fecal transplants for depression. Yes,
Absolutely.
we're getting to the shit. This is important. I mean, there has even been research and work done for children in with
Mhm.
autism, and other issues with the fecal matter transplant, and the benefits
Mhm.
they have found.
Yeah.
And it really builds upon, previous research on that gut microbe transplant, from depressed humans to germ-free animals. It actually resulted in behaviors resembling depression-like symptoms.
Yeah.
So it goes to
Yeah.
show you the incredible impact that those little buggies that make up, most of us,
Yeah.
they directly impact how we feel, how we can think or not think, hence the brain fog.
Yeah.
Speaking of brain fog, things like, the fatigue and what a lot of people
Yeah.
said, with the brain fog,
Yeah.
there's so much emerging research that's suggesting that microbial dysbiosis, when it's off
Yeah.
kilter, can actually trigger those inflammatory responses that
Yeah.
affect the brain function.
Yeah.
And because they are producing inflammatory cytokines, these metabolites that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they then influence these
Yeah.
neurological functions. And the majority of chronic conditions are based in inflammation and
Mhm.
mitochondrial dysfunction.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
So, it's all the more that really something I have come to realize in functional medicine and looking at root causes,
Mm.
digging deeper, really getting to the root cause of these issues. A lot of it, it does and come down to the gut. I mean, wasn't it what Aristotle or one of
Hippocrates.
them, Hippocrates, thank you, that all disease begins in the gut.
Yeah. Let food be thy medicine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. So why don't we dive down that a little bit? Why don't we dive down? If someone's on the webinar tonight, and we know that over 70% of people here kind of have those GI and or brain foggy sort of presentations. So if someone's saying, my gut ain't happy, where do I start, especially from a personalized perspective,
Mhm.
right? Knowing my genes, 70% of our audience has DNA 360s, right?
Right.
Where do you suggest they start to kind of get that guidance as to how they can start changing what's on their fork based on what's in their DNA? Where would you start, Dr. Barden?
One of the places that I start is I look at your detox pathways,
Okay.
uh, simply because if you are having a toxic load and you're not being able to
Yeah.
clear, that's going to disrupt the gut biome,
Mm-hmm.
because it can overload with toxins. And just with any food that you are taking in, unfortunately, a lot of our food now has toxins in it.
Mm-hmm. So
Is
let
your
me
body able to clear those, and
okay.
how well?
Let me ground this a little bit. So for our audience, if you have your report, you want to jump into the inflammation section specifically, and I think we'll start with the GST family. Okay, so look at your GSTs. All right. And so what Dr. Varden is saying, so anytime, remember that kind of think of your mouth to your excuse the lack of elegance here, your mouth to your butt. It's a tube. And in this tube, there's a lot of bugs. It's really creepy, people. We're going to survive this. So inside this creepy tube of yours, right? Once it gets to the gut and your gut's kind of turning it over and it's trying to extract the nutrition, and it's doing all its magic, right? As it's doing that, it's exposed to a lot of the toxins and other things that are hiding in your food, right? We know that when you pick up a fork and, often if it's broccoli or if it's wheat, it's going to come laden with glycophosphates and a lot of other gross things. What Dr. Varden is saying, and I want her to explore this a little bit, once you toss that into your mouth and it goes in, not all guts are created equal with their ability to deal with those glycophosphates. There's some genetic profiles that are better able to manage kind of that gunk that comes in with your food compared to others. Okay. Dr. Varden's going to go over those profiles. And remember, if she goes over those profiles and you're like, I am walking amongst the blessed. I have a great profile. I don't need to worry. The answer is you still do. It's more a comment of you have a lot more grace. It doesn't mean that you get to go drinking broccoli juice as if, it doesn't come with any glycophosphates. So, Dr. Barton, help the people understand, are they blessed or do they have to be a lot more careful with the gunk that is in their food nowadays?
Well, okay, so you said starting with our GST genes. This
Mhm.
is, and again, this is the anti-inflammatory reports. And these are your glutathione conjugation pathway genes. So GST, so GSTT1, GSTM1, GSTP1. So GSTT1, this is more like the systemic. It also works in the frontal lobe, large part of the brain, executive function for clearing out toxins. Glutathione is the master antioxidant molecule of the body. Okay. And it is very important for the liver, for clearing out these xenobiotics, cleaning out other toxins, cleaning out basic metabolic waste that our body produces. The GSTM1, this works more in the gut biome, in the biome of the lungs. Okay, so really important and does directly influence the health of your gut. Now, GSTT1, GSTM1, these are copy number variants. So you will see a number, either a 0, a 1, or a 2. So because we have 2 chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad, do they have that gene? If they don't, it's a 0. If they do, it's a 1. So that's where you can get those numbers. And if both of them have them, then you have 2. So for GSTT1, 2 would be optimal. Okay. 0, suboptimal. And the 1, obviously, that in between. Now, it's a little different for GSTM1. For the GSTM1, you would think, oh, well, 2 is optimal. Well, not really. The 2, actually, eons ago in our ancestors, yeah, the 2 was optimal because it's not like they could, well, maybe cook food, but maybe not originally, but they were eating a lot of microbes and other things. And so they needed an aggressive gut biome, to get rid of that. But nowadays, our genes have not kept up with our technology and our foods and things like that. And so for us, having 2 copies, which I do, it's a little over aggressive. Okay. And this can lead into having and being associated with autoimmune issues. Like, for example, we were talking about some skin issues, okay, eczema and other things. I happen to have to deal with psoriasis, on the scalp. That is how my 2 copies of my GSTM1 show up, and it can get worse in different things.
And let's be careful though, because having 2
Yeah,
copies does not mean you will have
correct.
autoimmune conditions. It
Correct.
just means if you're seeing a 2 on your page, it means you have a very aggressive biome and you run a greater risk for, but it does not mean by any stretch of the imagination you will have. It just, if you have 2 copies, you might want to work with a clinician to confirm you don't have an autoimmune condition happening. And separate, hopefully praises be you don't, right? What can you do in order to kind of ensure that doesn't come to be, right? Because I think autoimmune, as much as we want to think something in our genes, it's inevitable, we're starting to see more and more how much diet and lifestyle, and diet in particular, plays into this. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for, kind of giving that nuance, that, understanding, because you're right. And that's just one gene. They don't exist in a vacuum. They play on a team. I've got more aspects to my genes and to my lifestyle and the toxic load that I've been exposed to that has, incited that particular thing. And it does wax and wane depending on diet, depending on, time of year. So, but again, these are different ways, and I know I'm broad brush stroking it. So again, I do appreciate that clarity. So in any case, so really for the GSTM1, GSTM1, one copy would be considered more optimal. Okay. For the GSTP1, you'll notice that that is generally in letters. So you'll either have like an AA, an AG, or a GG. Okay. So the A's would be optimal, G's are suboptimal. And this really works more in the aerosolized, in how you can react to toxins that you are breathing in, that you're exposed to. But this does affect your gut biome. This does affect your ability to be able to absorb nutrients, that nutrigenomics, or well, actually kind of both, between the nutrigenetics on the foods, how your genes work with the foods. But if you're not absorbing them, then you have a little bit of a problem. I mean, I tell my clients, we are not what we eat, we are what our gut microbiome breaks down and allows us to absorb. But
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And has opportunity too as well. I think so. A lot of people on this webinar, I can imagine, if you're within this wellness space, you've probably heard the debate around gluten 5 times over, and you probably hate it at this juncture in time, because I would say probably every 4 wellness practitioners are like, gluten's the devil, stay away from it. And so GST1 plays into this conversation, right? So when we see people, and this is kind of that nutrigenetics, nutrigenomics, Dr. Varden, that you're talking about. So when people come to see us and they say, do I need to care about gluten? Because I love my croissant and it is my demigod, and if you take it away from me, I might hurt you. We have to look at 2 separate parts of our report in order for us to answer this, right?
Mhm.
So one part is HLA, right? This one part, it's a gene, and we've actually updated this in our report. So go on to your portal, because this is now up to date. We look at the HLA and we ask 2 questions. The first question is, are you genetically predisposed to being celiac? That is a very distinct diagnosis. It means when your body sees that gluten protein, it throws a temper tantrum and explodes a little bit. It's a very unique condition, right? Some people will have that propensity within their genes. Most people don't, though. The next condition that we ask the question of, are you sensitive to gluten? Okay, this is sensitive. So it's not the same as celiac. It's saying if your body's exposed to it, does it kind of react as if it's an aggravating, like, when you have a little sibling that comes over and you're like, oh gosh, they're going to be annoying. It's kind of like that. You can deal with it, but it's agitating. But if that sibling is there every day, then it becomes problematic, right? So we ask those 2 questions, and that's what your report can tell you. This will very, very distinctly influence your gut. Okay. Namely, if you're gluten sensitive and you continually consume gluten, you continually have this little sibling over, it's going to wear away at your gut lining. And that changes the permeability, stuff is going to leak in. And separately, it really changes how you're able to digest. And that, to Dr. Varden's point, is that conversation of chicken and egg, of what you're eating and what your genes say, right? But coming back to GSTP1, we don't just consider your HLA when we are looking at should you have wheat or not. And this is the P1 that she's talking about here. Because again, we know that when you're consuming wheat, unfortunately, wheat right now, unless you get it from Romania, I think that's the only place in the world right now that's still protected against certain herbicides and pesticides. But unless you get a very specific form of wheat that is free of glycophosphates, almost all wheat has this. And GSTP1 is the one that's going to be dealing with that in your gut. So if you have a G allele, G is in Gregory, meaning your presentation is either GG or AG, you're going to struggle with that burden within your gut. Okay. Meaning, especially the more en masse that you're consuming of wheat, right? The more en masse you're consuming that glycophosphate. Okay. The more likely you're going to have that reaction, which then sets the environment in the tube that connects your mouth and your bum, right? It's going to mess it up in the sense that you're not going to be able to extract well, and it's going to wear away at that lining, which then wears away at your capacity to pull out nutrition and deal with it. Oui? C'est bon, Dr. Varden? Did I capture all that
Oh,
correctly?
oh, that beautiful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's a few others that I do want to get to.
Please. Yeah.
Very important. the methylation pathway. I mean, you want to talk about how the methylation pathway works, because this can actually influence inflammation in the body. If you are not methylating well and you have higher homocysteine levels, well, homocysteine is one of the markers that are tested in blood serum that is and can show systemic inflammation. Remember what we said, that the basis of, chronic conditions is inflammation. So we want to look at ways on how we can support our bodies to have lower inflammation. So with your methylation pathway, we look at several of the genes in that pathway. There's 2 MTHFR genes. There's the SHMT1 gene. That one specifically, like I had mentioned earlier, deals more with folate, B9. Okay. And the form that would work best for you, especially if you are supplementing. Looking at the MTR gene, these work more and are associated more with cobalamin, the B12, what forms that work well for you based on your genetic, your variants that you may happen to have. So, for example, for the MTR gene, okay, whether you can handle a methylated form of cobalamin B12, that would be the A gene. If you have the A allele, okay, then if you have an AA, a methylated cobalamin is wonderful. You can handle that. If you have the G as in George allele in there, then you should probably do the adenylated form. It's called adenylyl cobalamin. And it's the same type of thing with folate, with the SHMT1 gene. If you have the G allele, you can handle a GG, then you can handle methylfolate. If you do have an A in there, then you really should have the adenylated form, which would come in the form of folinic acid, not folic acid. That actually can mess up your methylation pathway. But kind of going down that cascade of the pathway, you also have your COMT, okay, the COMT gene. This is your catechol-O-methyltransferase gene, dealing with the catecholamines and neurotransmitters. How quickly, are you clearing? But it puts that methyl group onto the substrate, okay, for toxins, for neurotransmitters, for, metabolites, like estrogen metabolites. All right. It's important to know how fast do you clear these things? How fast do you put the methyl groups on? And then that can help indicate where support might be needed. And then finally getting into the FUT2 gene, very important in gut health. In your gut, because between like the GSTM1 and the FUT2, depending on the variants, this instructs how well you are anchoring the gut biome and the food that they need to be able to have the gut biome flourish. So the FUT2 gene also works in with B12 absorption, because it has to be transported from the gut into the bloodstream. And the very interesting thing in this is that if you have a really good FUT2 gene that helps anchor, the biome, it actually is not such a great form for that B12 transport. It's just like, I can't win, but I can. So here is where knowing the form that you have, where and what does it do best, and then how to support the other way. So if you are not able to transport B12 from the gut into the bloodstream very well, then have a sublingual, have something that will dissolve more readily and get into the bloodstream directly from the oral cavity or from a transdermal patch, rather than having the gut have to go through all that. So this is really where the personalized medicine and healthcare comes in, and knowing, and the importance of knowing your genes for that. So, because there was something else that I wanted to touch on that is really important for gut health and like overall health, and that's vitamin D and the vitamin D pathway. Because these are things that I look at. I mean, it's just like, what do you look at? First of all, I kind of look at all of it, but trying to break it down to get a good idea on hey, what's the gut looking like? And then actually, hey, where do we need to focus on for the way the nutrigenetics portion of how are you genetically absorbing, utilizing the micronutrients that you're taking in. And I'm seeing a comment, a question here in the chat from Amy. She said FUT2GG. So again, the GG would state that you should have a sublingual B12. Okay, where the AA, it's you're easier for oral, supplementation, better transport from the gut. You're welcome.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we're like, I want to jump into questions and answers soon, but I also
Yeah.
want to make sure that we educate people as to what's on their fork, right?
Yes.
How do we approach the fork? So based on your knowledge of our diet and nutrition section, how would you go about guiding people as to, are they better, to support their fork looking at carby things? Are they better for looking at fatty things? Are they better for looking at a balance between the two? How do you guide people there, right? Because like
Right.
I already know, let's disclose to the audience. Dr. Varden's going to say whole foods, right? You can't get away with going to McDonald's and pretending like you can figure out your macros there. She's going to say whole foods. The question is, how do we focus those whole foods? Do we want to focus more on those delicious carby whole foods or those delicious fatty? I love food. I'm happy with both sides of the spectrum. But how do we focus our whole foods? Where do we go if based on our genes?
Okay, so in the diet nutrition reports, you'd be looking when you were talking about carbohydrates and starch. First of all, I want to mention carbohydrates, guys, is not just breads and pastas and this and that. Those are starches. That is a subcategory of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates also includes fruits, vegetables, complex carbohydrates that have fiber. Okay, these are the things that are really good for us and that our gut biome really likes. It likes those fibrous, complex carbohydrates. So, but one of the things that people think of as far as starches and the breaking down of carbohydrates, that would be our AME1 gene. Okay, that produces amylase in the mouth, in our saliva. Okay, so I mean, really, the beginning of the food that we eat starts in the head, the cephalic region. Okay, when before we even take that bite of food, when we think about food, when we smell the food, what do we start doing? We start salivating.
We are Pavlov's dog and nothing more.
Absolutely. And you don't even have to have, all you have to do is think about your favorite food. Okay. I mean, chocolate cake, warm and
Chocolate is a
steamy,
health
and you
goal.
got it. It's just like you can just start salivating. You don't even have to have it made, even though my daughter did make some. But
You best be sending some up here.
with a peanut butter frosting.
Oh, look at you.
So, but the thing is, it's like we start salivating because our bodies are preparing to break down the foods that we have. So one of the main enzymes in that is amylase, made from the AME1 gene. And depending on how many copies of that gene you have, the better or worse you are of breaking those carbohydrates down. So the A allele says you have less copies. By the way, you can have anywhere from 2 to 17 copies of the gene. All right. So if you have a T allele, okay, TT, that means that you're very good at breaking down these starches and these carbohydrates. So you probably have more of like that 17 copies. If you're on the AA, you're way on the other end and you don't break them down as easily. So that can be problematic. And a lot of times that it can relate to poor starch metabolism, but the more starches that you eat, that can increase the weight gain. Okay, there's an association with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people to hear, and that when we look at larger studies, okay, if you're someone with that suboptimal presentation of AMY1, and Dr. Barton confirming that means there's a T allele, right? If you have a T allele showing up, it means that you're not able to digest your carbohydrate.
Oh, no, no, no.
Oh,
I'm sorry. The T allele means that you
you're good?
can.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay, so
that's
it's
the
the
good
A
allele.
allele.
It's
It's
the
the
A
A allele.
allele that, yeah,
Okay.
that you do not break it
Yeah.
down as easily.
So if you have an A allele, what she's saying here is that when you take that bite of carbohydrate, right? Remember, not all people are created equal. That bite of cake may be the same, but your body's not going to receive it in the same way. So if you have an A allele creeping in there, you effectively aren't going to be able to break that cake down as well. You're going to be extracting more calories. You're going to be having that more propensity towards weight gain. And remember, this is cumulative, right? You're having the occasional bite of cake. Good for you, really doesn't matter in the larger scheme of things. It's probably good exercise for the gut. This is on that consistent basis. So when we talk about choices on your fork, if you have an A anywhere in your FUT2, you really want to be mindful of how much carb you're taking in particular, the simple carbs. Simple carbs are what Dr. Varden talked about, of the breads and the pastas and the tasty things, the cakes of the world, right? Your body effectively is like, cool, I see that. I'm putting that here. Whereas if you're more composed of the A's, still happens, but not as quickly as those with the A's. Okay. So I think that's a really important one. Yeah. Do you want to talk around fitty fat?
Oh, yes. Well, when it comes to fat, this would be more so our ApoA2 gene.
Mm-hmm.
So the ApoA2, this is actually working into it's part of the high density lipoprotein family, and the association works into fat consumption to fat gain. Okay, so if you have an AA version, there isn't any association. Now, I say this very generally, because obviously if you eat a crap ton of fat, it doesn't really matter how much you know perfection of genes that you have. I mean, your body can only burn so many calories, and then it's going to store things. So I mean, we're talking about reasonably. Okay, so in general, a person with like an AA profile, with say their ApoE is also, maybe a 3.3 or 3.2, and you look at some of their other aspects, maybe the FTO gene in the way that their gut brain axis communication is when it comes to that how quickly they feel full after they eat. Okay, again, no genes exist in a vacuum, they work together, but the ApoA2 is one of the main genes when it comes to fat consumption to fat gain. So the G allele actually is the suboptimal, where you do have to be careful with your saturated fat intake.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, if you have say a G allele or a GG and then maybe an AA in your AMY1, pastries, bread with butter, it's not your friend. Not
I,
something
I
that
would
we're
I
doing.
would say it's not that it's not your friend. You just need to take more of a French approach, right? That it's a
Oh,
small
yes.
accent. It
Yes.
is not the primary component of your meal, as we are cat bombed here.
Yes. Because I mean, some people say I look at, a piece of cake and I gain weight, where other people,
Yeah.
but it's in balance. And
Yeah.
I
And
do like that French approach. It's like,
yeah.
take a bite. If you like it, take two. If you really like it, take three. The rest, done.
Yeah, and I would offer, this is kind of where I really want to transition a little bit into the concept of appetite genes, because I think, I want to go to our questions and answers. We have a beautiful trove of them, but this is important to me insofar as I think sometimes when you and I, us as a collective, talk through genes, that influence how we metabolize things, we
Mhm.
get to this space of where I can't eat, and food becomes this very adversarial. I don't enjoy eating because I have to eat exactly like this or else. And I would say this is where, especially working with a clinician, understanding your appetite genes, your satiety genes, your moon behavior genes becomes all the more important, right? Because then you're not just focusing on the food, you're more focusing on how can I understand my appetite so that I work with it as opposed to against it, right? There's some profiles, there's some genes that will dictate how snacky are you? How easy is it for you to become satiated, right? When something stressful comes along, are you likely to be reaching for something? And the moment you know that, you can change your strategy. And so food is no longer the enemy. It's instead, okay, if this happens, here's how I respond in a way that feels good to my body. And that's a little bit where you can start developing that French relationship with food, that it's okay occasionally to have those good bites because you know you're not going to get lost in that, right? You're not going to get lost in eating the entire baguette, right? Instead, you're just going to be like, I had a bit. I also had a rough day, and I know this is what I need to do for my rough day. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where we really, as practitioners, we really look into that mood and behavior report, because that helps us to know from that genetic standpoint how your relationship to food is.
Yeah.
And the particular genes that Dr. Kosterman was talking about with that satiation, that satiety, is the FTO gene that I was talking about. That's one of them that deals with that postprandial, after eating sensation. Is the communication efficient, telling your brain, your gut telling your brain, saying, I've had enough, I'm full, stop eating?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it delayed? Unfortunately, I have a genetic tendency that mine is delayed. And if I'm not paying attention, I can eat and eat and eat. And all of a sudden I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm so full. It's like food baby. I am like after Thanksgiving dinner type of thing.
Yeah.
So I've had to learn certain techniques to be aware
Mm-hmm.
when I am eating, to pause, to actually watch what I'm putting in my mouth, to chew slowly, to allow that time for my gut to tell my brain, okay, I'm full. It's Hari Hachi Bu. Stop eating when you're 80% full.
Oh,
Um,
I like that.
yeah, it's a Japanese
Yeah.
phrase. And really that's what it is. And again, there are techniques that can be done in order to um, work with your genes, not against them. Don't be a victim to your genes. Be empowered by them. You just have to know how to play the hand you've been dealt. And that's what we're here for. We're here to teach you the rules of the game and then how to play it so you win. The other gene that she was talking about when we're talking about hunger cues, snacking, that's the MC4R gene. And, with that, there is a difference between the two, because the FTO gene, which stands for fat mass and obesity gene, that tells you when you are satiated, that when you're full, okay? Where the MC4R gene, that's more a satisfaction. That works more into, okay, I may have eaten and I'm full, but I'm still not satisfied. I needed that crunchy salty, or I needed that smooth and creamy, or that sweet, or it's that hunger, and wanting to have something. And this is where we tend to snack more, because you're wanting to satisfy that craving, which
Mm-hmm.
also mood and behavior genes come into play here. Okay, so which again just goes to show you genes don't exist in a vacuum. They do work together and they're all interacting with one another. But those are two major ones when it comes to your relationship with food and how that communication works.
Yeah. And how knowing it can empower things, right? So
Mhm.
my MC4R is suboptimal. And I could have told you that had I known, because I require dessert with every meal. I have dessert with breakfast. But now knowing that, I plan for a better dessert than maybe like sweet little treats all day long. But I plan for something that's sweet to kind of get that so that I can get to my next meal comfortably and then not feel like I need to be peckish in the middle. So knowing this really helps with how you manage food in a way that doesn't feel rough and gross. It feels a little bit more natural. And that's the goal, right? We don't want to there's enough fighting to be had in the world. We don't need to be fighting with our bodies. So on that note, I wonder if we can jump into our questions. Um, our first question is from Linda. Linda is saying that within the North American population, having no copies of your GST M1 is in Michael 1, um, is is normal. I'd have to look at data, but I believe that sounds correct. I don't know if it's a majority, but I do not believe it's abnormal or uncommon to not have any copies of this. I don't know if I'd be comfortable calling it the majority. I'll have to look that up and I'll see if we can post that somewhere so that you're made aware of that data. Okay. And I don't know if it's per se, and then she kind of comments like, is this because genes get destroyed over time? I think to Dr. Varden's point, I don't know if we've had enough pressure over the past 100 or 200 years to say like this has been selected out of the population. I don't know if that's a fair thing. I'll have to look at numbers over time. I don't know if those are,
Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, I did just do a quick thing. And in the International Journal of Genomics, this paper came out in 2023, and it was a review of the GSTM1 null genotype.
Mhm.
You know,
And
and
what does it say?
it is saying that the frequency of the null genotype is approximately 53% in
Okay, so
Caucasian
majority.
populations of North America and Europe. Yeah, African Americans frequency is like 23 to 41%, Asian Americans 32 to 53,
Yeah.
etc.
Okay. So it's and so here's what this means though for our audience, especially if you're a North American, probably Caucasian is the demographic that this is getting after. It's common, normal, okay to not have this, but I think the thing that you really want to focus on, what do you have to compensate for it? What is your T1? What is your P1? What are your other mechanisms that help clean up that gut area? And additionally, right, um, what are you feeding yourself? Because you, compared to your other counterparts, don't necessarily have that grace of ingesting a lot of toxins. Okay, so keep mindful of that. That might be why. I'm gonna hold that comment back. All right. Lydia has another question for us here. Um, which gut bacteria do we think tends to, oh, I love this question, Lydia. Which gut bacteria do we think tends to be the cause or associated with colon cancer? Um, what about in the mouth, or do we know that yet? Oh, I love this question. Colon cancer within our
Yeah.
lifetime. So to give a little, Dr. Varden, I love if you can answer this, but I want to give a bit of context before I pass the mic to you. Colon cancer. If we jump back 100 years, it was pretty much unheard of. It happened occasionally, but not really. And it was back then, a lot more associated to genes. We're seeing the rise, I think it's something like 70% in populations. Why is this? We are not pooping. We are not eating real food. Why is this? Think of your colon, right? Your colon, especially large colon. This is where your poop is gonna sit until you poop it out. And so if you are eating crap, i.e., you have a lot of a toxic burden sitting in your poop, right? It's going to be sitting there in that large colon, interfacing more with the body, right? Most people, hopefully, poop once a day. That means that large colon is holding on to that for about 24 hours. It's not this steel tube there where there's no interaction with the body. The body's still talking to the poop there, and there's still a bit of permeability. So things are going back and forth, right? So if you're not pooping often or you're eating crap, that colon is exposed to for longer and longer durations, all that crap. And what we're seeing is then this increase of colon cancer, right? So Dr. Varden, let's talk about the
Okay.
fix to that. What do people need to know, right?
Okay, well, actually, there was a Nature paper that was published about, some of these bacterium, and the Fusobacterium nucleatum. This species has been strongly linked to colorectal cancer progression. It promotes tumor growth, particularly in CRAS, which is a particular gene mutant for colorectal cancer tissue.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
so that one. Another one is the Porphyromonas gingivalis and Porphyromonas acrolytica. Now, these species can induce what we call cellular senescence. It's basically zombie cells, okay? And that can accelerate colorectal tumor development through butyrate secretion.
Yeah.
So here you were talking about, yeah, this is, very good, but too much of a good thing. Okay. And so there's a few others too.
Yeah.
Um, Streptococcus galolyticus. That species has been associated with higher rates of colorectal adenomas and carcinomas.
Hmm.
Talking about in the mouth. So oral bacteria associated with colorectal cancer. So the Fusobacterium nucleatum, which I had just said, the gingivalis, Streptococcus stomatis is another one. Those oral bacteria have actually been found to be in increased abundance in both early and late stage colorectal cancer, excuse me. There are some others, but yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of research, going
Yeah.
when it comes.
Lydia, for a deeper dive, and I wonder if the powers that be can put this into the chat. We did a webinar on this approximately 2 weeks ago, or at least we touched on it. I don't want to be specific, say we did an entire webinar on it, but we looked at cancer. And in particular, we looked at how food and bacteria will actually influence genetic expression in both positive and negative ways. And colon cancer was one of that because it's come up so much in the past 30, 40 years. We actually have very elegant studies that look at bad diet will turn on genes that then encourage cancer. And so if the powers that be can toss that webinar in here, you have a point if you want to go nerd out and study a little bit more. All right. Um, Gail was asking a question about fat absorption, and Dr. Vernon, I think you did a beautiful explanation of that when you were talking through ApoA2. So Gail, I hope we offered answer to that because I think Dr. Vernon did a spectacular job there.
I do have to
Oh,
say though,
please. Yeah.
when, like she had mentioned about the gut zoomer test showing fats getting through the blood,
Hmm.
that could indicate issues with fat metabolism or absorption related to genetic factors, yes, but
Hmm.
it can also be related to leaky gut.
Yeah.
When you are finding things in the blood that shouldn't be there, that's usually from leaky gut, okay?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
proteins or other, compounds that should remain in the gut, remain in that tube,
Yeah.
from mouth to anus. And they're, larger particles are getting outside of that, what we call parenteral,
Mhm.
um, then there's something going on. And if you have leaky gut, you're going to have leaky brain. So, which can lead to some of those issues that people were talking about and, marking off in our poll. So, when we talk about inflammation and brain fog and fatigue and things like that. So there are various things that need to be looked at.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that call out. Thank you for that call out. I think if you're seeing that in a blood sample, like for the nerds out there or the super curious out there, this is kind of cool. If you can find someone in your area that does live blood cell analysis, you can get pricked. They'll take blood and you can look at your live blood under a microscope. And oftentimes for people with leaky gut, you will see evidence of that just simply in what is swimming around in the blood. I would imagine there's probably YouTube videos that can do comparisons too, but it's amazing when there's permeability in the gut, what gets into the balance of the body. And this
Yeah,
again is
and
that.
and guys, I'll tell you that when it comes to healing leaky gut, food is a major component. That
Mhm.
and having good protocols, you
Yeah.
know, of being able to heal that, and certain gut biome that actually help, those keystone species that help to
Mhm.
repair the gut.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay, so Marcy, I believe that's Marcy, is asking a question. Are you suggesting that each of these results can coordinate to get more info? And so she's referring to 23andMe and DNS. I'm not sure what the DNS is, but I would offer with a good provider, right? I would say I would imagine 23andMe kind of gets at base genetics, so DNA 360, DNA 23andMe is if you're using our app, right? You can upload your 23andMe results into our app, and we can support some interpretation there of what we have, right? But separate to that, uh, a gut test, I imagine that that's what the DNS is for. I would say these having the two together are absolutely invaluable, right? Because with the gut test, you're able to say, what is the current state? How are my genes playing out? How is my diet playing out? And then you're able to say with the DNA test, like, how do I best support this? How do I shift this picture if I need to? I data is always better, right? I love we test, we don't guess. So if you're able to do both, I would say that's the most powerful thing that you can be doing. And to that end, I believe right now there's a 15% discount if you do either of those tests with us. And I think if you do both, we also toss in a bottle of Deep Calm. That was kind of the thing that I said I really love because it supports both head and tummy. So if you want to, I think the powers that be can toss that information into the chat. But if you're interested in getting either, 15% off right now. And then if you get both, you get that happy little bottle of Deep Calm as well. So I hope that got to your answer. I'd say both are really powerful together because one says where your body's at, and then the other one speaks to how do we best guide the solution to wherever body is at. Yeah. All right. Dr. Varden, I saw you zooming through some questions. What question do you want to talk? I think do you want to speak to Robin's question?
yeah, because she was talking about the copy number variants. So
Mhm.
really, when it's a copy number variant, that is saying how many copies of that gene you have. So it is very different than single nucleotide polymorphisms, where it's just a single nucleotide in the gene that is different, that is it's switched, or that there's something. When it comes to copy number variants, that is how many copies of the gene itself, like the entire gene, not just a letter in it being switched, but the actual gene itself. Do you have um, you know copies for that? And so with that, okay, she said that she has two of each. So having the two, like I said, for the GSTT one, that's optimal. For the GSTM one, that's good, but it's a little over aggressive. So what would that really mean? It means that you are producing, and your body can utilize glutathione, still could possibly need support, whether it be in the precursors like NAC, which is N-acetylcysteine, selenium, which you can get from having a few Brazil nuts, alpha lipoic acid, milk thistle, things like that as supportive. But when you have copies of them, one, two, in either, your body could actually process taking glutathione as a supplement, where some people who have null variants, meaning they have zero copies in both their GSTT1, GSTM1, having them take glutathione is not a recommendation I would do, because their body doesn't really know what to do with it. So that's where, that personalization can come in. And remember, glutathione is that master antioxidant molecule of the body and does a lot of wonderful things.
Well, all right. Linda has our next question, and she is asking if having a neurogenetic
Neurogenic.
Neurogenetic, thank you, colon, makes a difference in getting help for gut issues, especially a connection to brain fog, um, and depression, anxiety. So, and this person tests positive for both, meaning she has both. So for a neurogenic colon, even though I can't pronounce it, what it means is the nerves that innervate the colon, there's something funky going on there, which means it depends on the person, but oftentimes if you don't get the nervous system activation there, it means you're not going to get great peristalsis. That means that action to move food around, right? Remember we talked about this tube? Food sits in your tube for a while and you kind of mush it up and move it around. And so if you're not doing that, that can impact digestion and access to food, as well as how do you get it out, right? It also will impact, in some people, the anal sphincter. That's the sphincter just at your rectum at the proverbial bum, right? That will be closing off so that you can keep poop inside until you want it out, right? And opening when you want it out. So people with this condition, it depends on the person. We don't need to get into specifics here. They're either going to struggle with how food moves or how food stays in, okay? And so I would imagine, based on what that presentation in you, Linda, is, it would absolutely impact access to nutrition you have, risk of colon cancer, a few different things, right? And it would really impact kind of, I would say, diet strategies. And when those aren't really specifically honed in, absolutely it makes sense that there's a struggle of brain fog and anxiety and depression because that biome isn't being fed properly and you're not extracting nutrition. Now, I would be not doing you a service if I was to come on here and say, like, this is what you should do. I would really encourage you to connect with a functional genomics practitioner or someone that knows both of these spaces so that that personalized medicine plan can be made for you. Because I think it depends on the actual diagnosis you have, what nervous system impacts you have, and then separate to that, like, how do we create that strategy to support the consequences of that so you can get as much nutrition and as much, I would even offer kind of gut calming things as possible, because your gut's going to be a little bit agitated because things are either not staying there long enough or leaving or staying there a bit too long. So I hope that's helpful. If you want to reach out to us, I would imagine this could be a good candidate for our precision program. So we have reopened our precision program for 2025, and this is a program where we support really complex illness. We do a bit of a panel interview to ensure that you're a good fit, right? We never want to oversell or undersell. So we assess, is this a fit? Are you someone that we would be able to support? And if we don't think that's the case, right, we'll make sure we redirect so that you're getting good care elsewhere. Okay, if you're interested in this, or anyone else on the webinar as well, feel free to contact us. The email is ceo@thednacompany.com. The powers that be will toss that in the chat, and that will kind of kick off that intake process so that we can properly place you, be it within the precision program, or if we think there's another practitioner, another program that could be of support to you. Okay. I hope that was helpful, Linda. I hope we're able to support you in some form or fashion there, because it's a lot to deal with and it makes sense, and we want you well. Yeah. All right.
So
Back to Varg.
Lydia's question about einkorn wheat being acceptable for people who may be gluten sensitive. And I wanted to take this because I recently had a discussion with someone about this. And I will say that einkorn wheat is not considered safe for individuals with celiac, okay, or celiac disease or severe gluten sensitivity. But for people who have mild gluten sensitivity, they may be able to tolerate it better than modern wheat varieties, like Dr. Christo is talking about, that there's only that one wheat product that doesn't have, a lot of those toxins. But getting to the gluten aspect of einkorn, it does contain gluten, but its structure is different from modern wheat. It actually is, it's shorter, it's weaker and more brittle, the protein of the gluten protein for einkorn. Okay. So considering any type of celiac, you really want to stay away from anything that's gluten containing. For those people with the mild gluten sensitivity, it may be better tolerated due to that lower gluten content and the more simple structure of it. But again, an individual, their response can vary. So, if you do try it, because it is higher in protein, fibers, vitamins, minerals, things like that, do so with caution.
Mhm.
Experiment under supervision. So in case you do have any type of reaction, that can be, handled appropriately. So that's what I would, say in caution. Do you have any
Okay.
other comments on that?
No, no, other than some people in here might be lucky if einkorn wheat works for them. I'm jealous. All right. Robin's asking a question of, do you avoid B12 injections? So let me contextualize this. B12 again was that vitamin that we were saying, especially with your FUT2, if you have a certain presentation of it, your body's going to struggle bringing it in if through the gut lining. So one of the solutions to how do you get B12 if not through the gut, is going to be sublingual. So that's a lot of the tabs that Dr. Varden was talking about. You tap something under your tongue, and as it dissolves, that actually will go directly into the bloodstream. So it totally skips the gut and goes right into the bloodstream. The other option, and this is oftentimes, I think, the traditional, like if someone comes in with severe B12 deficiency, a doctor is going to toss you full of a shot. So what happens is they'll take uh, a little needle, they pop some B12 in, they shoot it into a muscle, and then over the course of a few days, that's going to disseminate through the body. Okay, so if you have access to a provider, absolutely. The one thing I would say here is just make sure you know what form is best for you. To my awareness, and I've never heard around the world this being different, you can get one of three forms. There's a cyanocobalamin, which I categorically do not recommend. There is a methylcobalamin, so that means methyl B12, and then there's a hydroxycobalamin, which means hydroxy B12. Okay, so I'd say you're really deciding between the hydroxy and the methyl. So check your genes. You want to understand which one is best for you and make sure you get the appropriate form there if you're going to go for these injections. And again, remember, it's sometimes better compliance if you're forgetful, like me, or if you just don't want to be taking supplements. The one thing I would caution, especially if it's the hydroxy, check out your COMT. If you're a really slow COMT, sometimes I find people with high dose hydroxy don't respond well because it, for reasons that we don't need to dive into, it kind of pushes methylation pathways faster than COMT can keep up with. So just check out your COMT status. If you're a slow COMT, sometimes I will avoid or advise people avoiding the hydroxy form. But again, as Dr. Varden was saying with the wheat, that's a little bit you can experiment with and you can feel it out, right? Genes don't dictate everything. There's an element of balance there. Okay. All right. Next question, Medell.
All righty. Marcy is asking what genes for FUT2 are most beneficial. Well, that depends. Because again, this is one where it's like a double-edged sword, where it's if it has the best efficacy for B12 transport from the gut to the bloodstream, that would be the AA version. It's not very good for anchoring the gut biome, and doing that. So it's like you either have one or the other. Again, that double-edged sword. So is there, an optimal? It depends on what it is that you're looking for optimal. And I know that's a crappy answer, but I mean, it is what it is.
It
And
can also be a powerful answer, right? Because it
yes,
really means you get to work with someone and be information empowered. Yeah.
yeah.
All right.
So
Diane has our next question. I love this question, Diane. This is a really interesting one to me. If we have a huge overgrowth of opportunistic bacteria from antibiotic use, meaning it took some antibiotics and then it killed off the good stuff and the bad stuff grew back instead, should we try and take those bacterial levels down first before fine tuning with the DNA knowledge? So I'd say I would say at that point in time, a gut 360, be it our main product or the premium, would be absolutely advisable. Because what you really want to know is not all overgrowths are created equal. You really want to know what strains, what populations are out of whack, because that will really change how do we do food recommendations. Do we need to do some herbal or other things that are going to more aggressively influence that biome? Right? You want to know the makeup so that you can be strategic with your medicine, right? Test, don't guess. If you're saying there's an overgrowth, if you're saying something funky is going on, we want to know the specifics of the funk instead of guessing the funk. Okay. And then from there, especially once things are reestablished, that would be more that opportunity for the more that preventative side of things, right? Of where that DNA 360 can more come in. I would say, if you're ever struggling with something acutely, right? Your arm's chopped off, focus on your arm being chopped off before you focus on what do your genes say about that. And so in this instance, I would say definitely go with that gust testing, understand what that is, and in parallel also do that gene testing. So from the prevention perspective, as well as kind of the ancillary support, you can be better guided there. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Dr. Vardens, would you like to take the next one from Nina?
Okay, so she's saying, could bacteria be genetically engineered to emit UV light and thus create vitamin D on our skin? And also have a gene that turns them off, oil, so that the treatment is not permanent, but in two parts. That's a very intriguing concept. And to be perfectly honest, I would never say never.
It's very dystopian. It's very like if we lose the sun.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there is so much that scientists and um, progress, like what we have and what is available, what has already been tested and become, there's a lot more than what the general population knows. I have family in military intelligence and other things. And so I know that there's a lot of stuff that is not in mainstream, but is in reality. That in particular, I don't know. But honestly, I mean, whenever you think about genetic engineering, that stuff's being tested, all sorts of ways. Obviously, there'd be safety concerns with UV light, especially UVB, because that can cause, well, actually, even UVA, causing DNA damage, increasing skin cancer risk. I mean, that's the whole point of needing sunblock, and not being out in the sun too long. So, very intriguing thought. But I don't have any real answers, for that question. But thank you for asking it.
A fun dystopia. I hope we never get to the point where we need an answer to that question. That's my
That's
hope.
true. Of course, then again, it's like scientists will experiment with things we don't really need anyway,
Yeah.
but we
Yeah.
won't go
Yeah.
there.
We're colonizing Mars. Might as well figure it out. All right. Kim has the question that's closing us out tonight. She is asking, I do have a question about good macro break down the diet based on one's gene. How can we design for this? Um, so I'll give you two answers, right? If you have your 360, I think that's a really good start, right? Because the 360 can really say to you, right? Here's how you deal with carbs. Here's how you deal with fats. Here's how your body is able to receive proteins to a certain extent. Okay. So I would say that might be your first access point. If you're looking to personalize it beyond that, I'd really, really, really encourage you working with a practitioner. I'll kind of advertise ours because I think we have the best around, and I'm really proud of our practitioners. Because we'll also be able to consider things outside of just what are the macros that your genes say. We'll be able to consider appetite. We'll be able to consider all the inflammation things that Dr. Varden has gone over this evening and the kind of the detox, how you clean your gut. But also over and above that, we can also look at your health goals, right? Macros really will impact health goals to a certain extent. And so I would offer the best plan is kind of a combination of genes plus what are you looking for, and working with a practitioner to paint that beautiful picture, paint that beautiful, yeah, that scene, because I think medicine needs to be personalized. Genes are the first step, and then working with a practitioner who knows how to enliven that in your world is really important. So be that through program, whatever that looks like. I would hope um, you want to go on that journey with us, and we can support that. Justin in particular, Justin's one of our providers here. He's spectacular with kind of macro assignment, but then separate to that, how do you make that real and how do you actually gain traction? Because I think that tends to be the tricky thing, right? Everyone can get a good diet plan. Very few people actually follow it, and he's very good at how do you actually follow it? Yeah.
We do have a question from our
Do
YouTube
we?
Live. Yes, Nicole Slinger asks, which gene tells you whether you shouldn't be a vegetarian? Is it FUT2? And she's asking about the GGAG or AA.
Mm-hmm.
So now, speaking about the FUT2, because we brought it up several times during this webinar, the genotype, there we go, it is associated, like I had said before, with lower vitamin D levels because of that lack of ability to transport from the gut into the bloodstream, especially on a vegetarian diet, where the AA genotype is better able to maintain those adequate levels on a vegetarian diet. So yes, that can influence, but is it the only gene that influences it? No. Okay. There are more things, just like Dr. Kosterman was talking about with our previous question, that, really working with someone who can look at all of the puzzle pieces, your DNA just being one of them, also looking at your current gut biome. What population do you have to work with? Because again, there are phylums, these families that are better at breaking down certain types of foods, these macros, like she was saying about Firmicutes, really good at breaking down the fats, Bacteroidetes, really good at breaking down the carbohydrates, etc. So, if you want to know, a better, well-planned dietary structure for you, then we need to know all these different puzzle pieces. We need to know history. We need to know food sensitivities and then how all of that works. So
Yeah. I would offer additional to that because I think when people talk about plant-based diets, right, it's not always just a health consideration. For some people, it's a heart and spirit consideration. And so I think for those people, especially that are like, I'm going to do this no matter what, independent of what my FUT2 is, I think working with a provider is one of the best things you can do because then you can do it intelligently. And so I was plant-based for about 25 years. And so I used to get all of the veg heads coming to me, right? And I would say, if you're willing to do the work, almost anyone, I'll qualify that. There are certain people that can't be, but almost anyone can be it. Just be aware if you have a DNA profile that says you shouldn't be plant-based, it means you're going to have to work 3, 4, 5 times harder. Can you still do it? Absolutely, but you have to do it well. Okay. So I'd say that's really, especially if this is a decision that you need support on, talk to someone. Compared to what I think Dr. Varden just talked about is, is this a should I or should I not? Right. So that would be my 2 cents there, because I'm very passionate about supporting that community if they're amongst the blessed that have that option. Yeah. All right. I think that's it, Dr. Varden. I think that's it for us.
yes.
Friends, goodness, we have such a large, happy following who stayed with us through the end. So thank you so very much for sticking with us. And please, it's really important to myself and Dr. Varden that we offer value, that we're always speaking to what you want to know. So there are surveys that go out after this. Please make sure you give us feedback. Are the topics what you're looking to see? Are we making good use of your time? Are we serving what you want to know? Because we want to make sure that when we show up, we're offering that good support. Because Dr. Varden's brain is invaluable, and we want to make sure that you're getting the best of that brain. And we can, unfortunately, she doesn't read minds yet. It's my hope.
I'm working on
Learning
it.
goals for you this year, Medell. I know.
I know.
Learn to read minds, and then we can figure it out. We don't have to survey people, but until that happens, please do make sure that you fill out surveys so we know what you're interested in, what topics you care about, and we can better serve you. I think
We
that's all.
appreciate all of you for being here,
Mhm.
for taking your time out. And we certainly hope that you have learned something tonight, something that you can take
Mm.
away and build upon. So that's what we do. That's what we're here for.
All right.
Thank
Shall we
you.
dance out, Medell? Because dancing
Oh,
helps the
yes.
brain, which helps the gut.
Yes.
That is the point.
I want happy bugs.
Don't we all want happy bugs? Au revoir, mes amis. See you next time.